All right. Well, my name is Michael Clapp, and I'm currently serving as your broker. There's a couple of new faces, so that's good to see. Hopefully, I won't be your broker for very long, not because I don't want to be, but because Veronica's getting her broker's license, and we'll just switch out who's serving as your broker. I'll still be an investor in the Market Center, so I still have a vested interest in making sure that you guys do really well and make a lot of money, right?
Right.
Good. My day job, when I'm not here, is I am the Veronica at the Northeast Market Center. I'm the team leader over in Kingwood. So that's where I'm at the other days of the week other than Thursday afternoon when I'm helping out teaching this class. So you've got 4 contracts classes that we ask that you can complete as a newly licensed associate, or maybe you're new to Texas and you're trying to get familiar with our Texas forms. And this is kind of the, I would call it the catch-all class. It's kind of the one where I kind of take several different pieces and kind of throw them together. So we're going to kind of do some flipping around on different topics, so kind of stay with me and I'll try to make sure you understand we're moving from this topic to this topic so you don't get too confused. So the 3 topics that we're going to cover today are buyer-tenant representation. Then we're going to talk about writing an offer that's contingent upon the sale of another piece of property in order to close. And then the 4th thing that we're going to do, or the 3rd thing, excuse me, that we're going to do is amend or terminate a contract, and then some of the forms that you need to kind of collect between contract and close, some of those documents. So that's going to be kind of the 3rd section that we'll go over. So I'm going to start with buyer-tenant representation. And what you've got there in front of you is 2 different buyer-tenant representation agreements. You have our own internal buyer-tenant representation agreement, which has our logo up at the top, and it's only 2 pages long. This form is coming up on 2.5 years old, or almost 3 years old, coming up in May. And we have found that by offering this form to our associates for them to use in presentations to either buyers or tenants has greatly increased the number of people getting it signed, primarily because it's short and sweet. So being short, it obviously is not as sophisticated as the TAR form. It doesn't have as much breadth as the TAR form has in it. It is razor focused on buyer-tenant representation. And so let's talk about what really is buyer-tenant representation and what we're trying to accomplish. I think if you can understand it in this context, and in some cases, maybe in your presentation to the buyer, you're more likely to get them to agree to signing an agreement with you. You need to start thinking of your buyer-tenant representation agreement as a buyer listing agreement, because we understand the seller listing agreement. We understand the relationship that we have with a seller. And likewise, the seller understands that once they sign a listing agreement, they're committed to working with that agent as their agent, right? Most sellers don't continue to interview agents after they've signed a listing agreement, right? However, sometimes buyers, after meeting an agent that can help them buy, what do? They keep talking to other agents. And so we're trying to reel them in and go, no. You've signed with me. I'm your agent. I'm the person that's going to help you. So if you can kind of help them understand that the relationship that a seller has with the listing agent is exactly the same relationship that they would be getting with you by signing a buyer-tenant representation agreement, maybe that would help clear the confusion that they have over what that means. And so what can you do for them as a buyer agent versus just an agent? Well, you're going to treat them as a client versus a customer. Is there more things that you can do for a client than you can do for a customer? Sure there are. And in fact, I think inside the Ignite workbook, you've got maybe a little checklist that kind of shows the difference between customer-client relationship. And that might be a part of your presentation that you use. There's a buyer presentation in Ignite that you need to be using when you meet with a buyer to show them the value of why they should be hiring you versus just calling off signs or responding to anybody that's on the internet or anything like that. So what do we want to accomplish by getting the agreement signed? Well, the first is the thing that we just talked about, loyalty. We need for them to be loyal to us, and likewise, we are pledging our loyalty to them. So in the agreement here, it talks about obligations and representations. That's the loyalty paragraph. We promise to be true to each other and not go cheat and sleep around on each other, okay? So we're trying to make sure that there's that contractual relationship between us and the client. The second thing that we want to get accomplished is our compensation. We want them to understand that we are not doing this for free, that we expect to get paid for our services. However, we also want them to understand that the primary source of our payment is going to come from the listing brokerage. When the seller or the landlord meets with the agent that's listing their property, they are securing the compensation for both themselves and us, right? So we need for them to understand that, but we also want them to understand that in the event that compensation is not available to us, they're responsible for paying it. Now, when would that normally come up? When would we not have compensation secured in a transaction?
When they go for sale by owner?
For sale by owners. Can we go and get for sale by owner compensation secured? Yes, we can. And you would use a form called the registration between broker and owner. We sometimes refer to it as the one-time showing agreement. So the way that you could get your compensation secured on a FSBO is by meeting with the property owner prior to bringing your clients, sitting down with them and talking about representation, the fact that you've got clients, you give them the IDS, and you ask them, do you want to be represented in this transaction? Or, at a minimum, are you willing to pay me the compensation that I would normally be earning should I take these buyers to any of the other hundreds of homes that are listed by real estate agents in your neighborhood? And they go, oh yeah, we'd be willing to pay you the 3%. We just don't want to pay the 3% that we would pay on the buyer side. Well, that's what the broker registration firm does. It secures your compensation. So you can see that a huge percentage of the time, your compensation is going to be secured. You're not going to have to go up to the buyer for them to pay it. The third thing that our form does that for me as the broker, I really want to make sure we get accomplished. And that is the approval to act as an intermediary. That is a huge issue from a brokerage standpoint. Now, when the listing agent meets with the seller and has them sign a listing agreement, for those of you that have been through the listing class with me, you'll remember that there's a box on there that says intermediary authorized. The listing agent and the seller agree that should another agent from our office bring the buyer to the transaction, that seller is in agreement that they're willing to go into an intermediary relationship, right? We need the same thing from buyers. So the only way we get that in writing is by having them sign one of these two forms, okay? So in our Keller Williams form, it's kind of there. It basically says when you sign the form, you're agreeing to it. And the TAR form, you got to check the box saying I agree to intermediary. So just make sure that you're always getting intermediary authorized. Because if you did have a buyer that was writing an offer on one of our office's listings, and we go into an intermediary relationship, what's the form that we need to attach to our offer? You know which form? It's not in your package, so no cheating. It's called the Notice of Intermediary. Okay? And so it's kind of a notice to both the seller and the buyer saying, remember that intermediary stuff we talked about back at the very beginning? We're there. And the broker is either going to appoint agents to the seller and to the buyer, or is not going to appoint. When would the broker not appoint? If you're the listing agent and you've got the buyer. There's no appointments there. But if you've got the buyer and you have the seller, then I'm appointing you to those parties. Okay? If you've got both sides of it, then there's no appointments. So you would check that box on the form. But we've got to have the intermediary authorization in writing. And we only get that in the listing agreement and in the buyer-tenant representation agreement. That notice is not an agreement. It's just saying, you've agreed to be an intermediary and we're there now. Just letting you know this is what we were talking about. This is intermediary. Does that make sense? Okay. So on the form, I'm really just going to cover the Keller Williams form as opposed to the TAR form. If you want to go through the TAR form, you'll find that it kind of covers a lot of the same areas plus. But I'm just going to cover a few of the issues on the Keller Williams form. And up at the top, you've obviously got dates that need to be filled in and areas that need to be filled in. So the dates obviously kind of cover, like a listing agreement would be, when does it start and when does it end? Now for some buyers, they might be reluctant in signing the form immediately. So what you could offer to them is a very short time period. Say, you know what, I really don't work with buyers unless they agree to be in a buyer-tenant representation agreement with me. So here's what I'm willing to do is let's date for the next 2 days. And if we really decide that we can work well together, then we'll get married and take it a little bit longer. So I'm only going to make this work for the next 2 days. And if we decide that we want to work together after that, then we'll just do an extension of this agreement. Okay? So that might cause someone to move from being opposed to signing to kind of go, oh, well, okay, she's not going to hold me to this long-term agreement. I'm willing to sign it for at least the next 2 days. Is that better than nothing? I think so. The other is the location or the geographic portion of the agreement. So up at the top it says the market area is defined as. So you could put the state of Texas, or you could make it really specific, 77059, or the Kleinwood subdivision, or some really specific area that would make sense from a geographic standpoint. Klein ISD, zip codes. You can get down to 5 MLSs that you might be showing them today. Put those 5 MLS numbers on there. Okay? So that way you're kind of secured as acting as the buyer's agent on those transactions. You're representing them in the event that they decide to move forward and making an offer. Okay? So on the TAR form, it's kind of got the same kind of blanks there for both term and for geographic area. And then your compensation, I think this one that I'm showing you kind of has it filled in at 3% in the event that it's a sale and 50% of 1 month's rent if it's a lease. But I believe when you pull this up under dot loop, those are fields that have to be filled in. So you probably want to use the same numbers, 3% and 50%. And then it also has a blank in there for you to put an administrative fee or a transaction fee, which is similar to what some listing agents might charge if they decide to charge a fee above and beyond the compensation that they would be paid. Now, if you're planning to charge a transaction fee or an administrative fee on your buyer-tenant representation agreements, that is the fee that the buyer would pay at closing. That's not something the seller is going to pay on the buyer's behalf to you at closing. And we have some agents that are successful in collecting that buyer representation fee. So if you want to charge an administrative fee or a transaction fee, there is a blank on here for you to insert that amount. And there's also a place on the TAR form for it too. So just like when I talk about that fee on listing agreements, in my mind, it's for above and beyond service, something that you're offering your clients above and beyond what the average agent is doing. It's a way for you to increase your income yield on a transaction. And it should cover some costs that you might be offering that's above and beyond what normal agents do. So if you're doing something really special for your clients in the process of their representation and closing that transaction, then there's a way for you to collect that fee or to cover that cost by collecting that fee. Okay? You've got a special provisions paragraph on the Keller Williams form, so there's a place for you to insert any additional information that needs to be covered. Let's say that maybe you're doing an advertising campaign where you're stating that if you choose Michael Clapp to represent you on the purchase of your next home, I will pay $50 towards your home inspection cost, something like that. You know, I'm offering some incentive. Well, then that's a place to document that incentive. Put it here. Now, if I'm paying an incentive, just FYI, I like to pay it at closing, so that's probably the way my thing is worded. I will reimburse client $50 at closing for blah, blah, blah. Because if we're closing, what are we doing?
Getting paid.
We're getting paid, we're making some money. I don't like paying money if I'm not making any money, so I'm only gonna pay them that fee if we're actually closing a transaction. So that's one way to kind of make sure you're not writing checks out left and right when you haven't had a closing yet. Or maybe you're doing a donation to a specific charity for every transaction that you close, and that's kind of near and dear to your heart. You know, for every transaction I close in 2015, I'm making a $50 donation in the client's name to the American Cancer Society or, you know, the American Lung Society. Maybe there's something that you're, you know, near and dear to you, and you're kind of advertising that fact. Well, here's a place to kind of document. I agree to do that. Okay. Kind of a place for special divisions. You don't have too many other reasons for anything in special divisions. Okay? So, behind the TAR form, so if you'll flip a couple of pages behind the TAR form, you will come to this additional notice form for a prospective buyer. And so, as a brokerage, we have this as one more form that we want to make sure all of our buyers get signed. Not Keller Williams, but the Texas Real Estate Commission and the Texas Association of Realtors have lots of forms out there that they've kind of thought are really good for a buyer to have. And not to say that you couldn't use those forms, but what we found as a brokerage is that if we took those 5 or 6 forms and kind of broke them down to what's really most important on those forms and put it on this 2-page document, agents are more likely to ensure that they get signed. So we've had this form in place for at least 7 or 8 years. And it really just kind of goes through some of the most important aspects of the purchase transaction. It also tells the buyer that this is an important step and they've got to take ownership of that process, and they shouldn't just be relying on us to ask questions that we think the buyer might have. The buyer has got to be instrumental in being inquisitive about things they don't understand. So if they want to know more information about a survey or a title policy or insurance coverage, then they should be going to the experts in those fields and getting their questions answered. We are not the experts in all those fields. We are a facilitator to the transaction. So this is really what I would call our CYA form. It's gotten a lot of our agents out of a little bit of trouble, maybe after a transaction is closed, where the buyer has kind of come back and said, well, my agent never told me. And we kind of pull this puppy back out and kind of go, are those your initials? Looks like your initials. This is what we told you right here. So it's our CYA form. So we want to make sure that all of our buyers sign this form. Okay? New construction, resale, buy a lot, doesn't matter. We want our buyers to sign off on this form. Okay? And this is in .loop, so you should be able to find it in your template when you're writing it off. So there would be 3 forms that I would be presenting to a buyer at my buyer consultation. What's the first form that I would want to stick under their nose?
IBS.
IBS. We always want to give them that form first. What's the second form?
VRE.
Possibly. I like actually using this form, because I think giving this form to them second builds value. If I walk them through this notice form, they kind of go, wow, I'm glad I found you. I didn't realize it was going to be this complicated. There's a lot more to it than just looking at houses. And I go, you're right, and here's my buyer representation agreement. You can do it the other way, but to me that kind of just makes sense to kind of build that value to where you slide in at the end and go, there you go, sign here. Here's my buyer representation agreement. So any questions on buyer tenant representation? Oh, y'all are quite good today.
You are saying that basically if you're using the Keller Williams form as a buyer rep, then you're not dealing with this one at all.
Right, pick one. It's not both, it's one or the other. We just find that our agents are a lot more successful getting the Keller Williams form signed just because it's easier to go through. It's faster, simpler.
Less is better.
Yeah, less is usually
People
better.
are having to agree.
Yeah, and it covers really the big rocks of wanting to get buyer tenant representation completed. All right, so now we're going to switch gears. We're going to go back to writing an offer. So we've got buyers that are ready to buy a home. And they own a home right now over in Terra Nova West. And they need something newer and bigger. So they decide to buy in Glenlock Farms. So they call us and they go, hey Michael, we are thinking about buying something bigger and newer. We're just a little tired of having a house that was built in the 80s. We want something a little bit newer and bigger. Our family has grown. So if you can help us find the right house over in Glenlock Farms, and we can get it under contract, then we'll let you list our house over in Terra Nova West so we can get it sold in time to purchase the house in Glenlock Farms. So they've kind of given me a little bit of a hint that it potentially may be a requirement that they sell this one first before they can qualify to buy that house. Now, am I the agent? Am I the person that's going to make that decision for them? Who helps them make that decision? The lender does. So we want to make sure they're talking to a loan officer or a mortgage company that is helping them to identify their assets, their income, their debt to income ratios, all those things, to determine whether or not they need to sell this property in order to buy this property. If their purchase of this property and the ability to get a loan approval is contingent upon showing proof of proceeds from the sale of this house in Terra Nova West, then we're going to end up using this form that's next in your package. Now, sometimes...
What's the name of that form?
The Addendum for Sale of Other Property by Buyers. It was right behind the TAR Buyer Tenant Representation Agreement. Did you find it?
Yes.
Now, sometimes people can buy without selling. They've got enough income, they've got enough saved, and they can qualify to purchase and then put this house on the market. But I'll tell you that the majority of folks need to get this house sold and closed prior to being able to get loan approval for their purchase here. So in order to protect their earnest money in this transaction, we're going to disclose to the seller that their ability to close is contingent upon this house successfully closing. So in our offer, we attach this form. And this form basically has 4 paragraphs to it, A, B, C, D, right? So in paragraph A, we're going to describe this transaction. Now, if we have an offer on this house, if we have a contract that we've executed, maybe people from Austin that came along and put an offer in on this house over here in Terra Nova West, then we know when this transaction is expected to close, right? April 30th, let's say. Because we can look at that contract. So we would say in paragraph A that our purchase of your home is contingent upon this property selling on or before April 30th. Everyone see that in the blanks? Then in paragraph B, we've got an amount of time that we have to agree to with the seller. And for example purposes, let's just say that we negotiate 2 days in there, or the second day. I think it might be the way it reads. And let me fill the rest of this out, and then we'll come back and explain why this works. C is more earnest money. So the earnest money that you would probably end up negotiating in paragraph C is going to be somewhere between 50 to 100% of paragraph 5 of the contract, which is our earnest money contract, earnest money paragraph, right? So on top of page 2 of our contract, if we're buying this house for $400,000 over here in Glenlock Farms, how much earnest money do we probably offer if we were making that offer there? What's our normal earnest money to purchase price ratio?
1%.
About 1%. So we probably had $4,000 in paragraph 5 of that contract, right?
Right.
4%? 1%?
Right.
Get it? Okay. So here in paragraph C, maybe we end up negotiating $2,000. And I'll walk you through how this is all going to play out here in a second. D basically says that if during the process we're about to talk about, things don't come together, the buyer is going to be in default. So how does that work? Well, let's say that we get under contract with Glenlock Farms. We get inspections done. We get out of the option period. So in the MLS, this house has moved from active to OP to PS. What does PS stand for?
Pending sale? Or pending continue to show?
Pending continue to show. Why is that important? Because when we, the other agents in the MLS, are pulling this property up and we see PS, we know that that listing agent is kind of giving us a clue that we still want them to look at the house. And why would we still want buyers looking at our house? Because it's a contingency. This is not a done deal. This is only going to be a done deal if this is a done deal. Make sense? So it's PS in the MLS. People from Dallas had actually looked at this house almost 2 weeks ago, but they didn't pull the trigger. Now they're back. They were able to unload their Dallas Cowboy tickets, even though Romo's going to be the quarterback again. They didn't think they could get rid of him, but some sucker bought him. So now they're back. They're moving to Houston, and they contact their agent again, and they say, "Hey, is that house over in Glenlock Farms still available?" He pulls it up in the MLS. He goes, "Oh, it's under contract, but it looks like it might be a contingency. I'll double check with the listing agent." So he calls the listing agent here at Glenlock Farms and goes, "What's going on with your house that we saw a couple of weeks ago?" And he goes, "Gosh, I wish you guys had made an offer because we have ended up accepting a contingency. It's got a 2-day pop-out clause on it, but we would love for your buyers, if they like the house, to write a backup offer." You follow me so far? Is anybody lost? Okay. So Dallas buyers, yeah, they think about it. They go take a look at some other homes that have come up on the market over the last 2 weeks and just don't find anything that they like any better than Glenlock Farms. So they do decide to write a backup offer. They pull out a contract just like they were going to make an offer, and they fill it out just as they would. But attached to their offer, they're going to attach the next form that you've got in your package, which is the addendum for backup. And in the addendum for backup, they've got 2 blanks they got to fill out. Paragraph A says, this is a contract that is behind the first contract dated such and such. So basically, they get to find out what was the executed date of this contract. Let's say it was 2/20. So they're going to stick February 20th in paragraph A. Then in paragraph B, they've been told by the listing agent that this transaction had a 2-day pop-out clause on it. So in paragraph B, they decide to write 3 days in there. They want to give the first contract the 2 days that it has plus 1. Okay? So they fill out their backup addendum along with the contract. They submit it to Glenlock Farms listing agent, who presents it to the sellers. They go back and forth and negotiate, and they finally come to an agreement. When they come to an agreement, they sign the agreement, they deliver earnest money, they deliver option fee, just like you normally would on any other transaction. Okay? It's just that it's a backup contract. The contract gets executed by the listing agent with that date in it, everything as normal. Okay? As soon as this contract, this backup contract is executed, the Glenlock Farms agent and the sellers notify the Terra Nova West buyers that they've accepted another contract, and they use the next form in your package to do that. They have to do it in writing. So this form in paragraph A says, seller has accepted another written offer to purchase the property. People from Dallas. You may either waive your contingency by notifying the seller in writing of the waiver and depositing the required additional earnest money as with the escrow agent under the time required under the addendum for sale of other property by buyer. Or if you decide not to waive your contingency, then your contract will terminate and your earnest money will be refunded to you. Okay, so they basically said, you have the 2 days that we agreed to decide whether or not you're going to stay in, and if you stay in, you waive your contingency, or get out. Now, if you stay in and waive your contingency, you got to put more money up. We want $2,000 more deposited.
How do you determine that? No.
We agreed to it. When we wrote this offer, we attached this addendum to it, and we submitted to Glenlock Farms what we wanted in paragraph B and C, and we ended up negotiating 2 days and $2,000.
Okay. So what gives you the option, I'm missing something, to go up another 2,000? You're saying, he never paid the 2,000 originally, right?
No, he only paid 4
Okay.
when he wrote the offer, right? Because it was only $4,000 in paragraph 5.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But I said, if you, Mr. Seller, and I'm talking as the buyer, if you, Mr. Seller, get another contract, you've got to give me time to decide whether or not I want to stay in or get out. And if I decide to stay in, I'm waiving my contingency, and I'm going to put $2,000 more on the line.
Got it. Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, paragraph D says that if I waive my contingency and my purchase does not happen because this doesn't happen, then I'm in default, and Mr. Seller, you can go after me for default, which is primarily you get to take all my earnest money. So they would get $6,000 in earnest money. But that only happens if 2 things take place. 1, they get a backup offer. And 2, I make the decision to waive my contingency. So I get those 2 days to decide what I'm going to do. What do I want to do during those 2 days other than just get on my knees and pray? I want to figure out if this is going to close. I want to start calling the agent representing the Austin buyers. I'm going to call the loan officer representing the Austin buyers. What's happening or what could happen that could keep Austin from successfully closing? Because if he doesn't close, I can't close. Now, if I start hearing lots of good news during those 2 days, then I may go, I'm willing to roll the dice. I'll put my original $4,000 on the line plus $2,000 more. If I'm not hearing good news here, then I might go, it's not worth it. I thought this was a stronger transaction than it really is turning out to be, so I don't think I'm going to waive my contingency. I'm going to terminate. So whatever I decide to do, in that same form that the seller sent me, I answer in section B. So the buyer responds back inside the time that we agreed to with his answer. I'm in or I'm out.
That 2-day clock starts when the Dallas contract is executed.
Correct.
Okay.
It can't start when Dallas shows back up and says, hey, is your house still on the market? It has to be a written
There has to be a
contract.
contract. Okay. Then he has, the Terra Nova guy has the 2 days, and he can say, well, I'm not going to exercise that and get his original $4,000 back.
Yep.
Otherwise, he pays the $2,000 and he just
And he hopes this takes place.
could lose more. Yeah. Okay. All right.
So would you be sending this, the addendum for sale of other property, or the notice regarding the contingency, are you sending this like a couple days before the 2 days, or basically when you get the backup offer, or the backup
Yeah, the
contract?
seller is going to send this form as soon as he executes this backup contract. So as soon as he executes that backup contract, he's delivering that to him because he wants that to be happen. He wants to happen quickly, right? He wants these people to make their decision as quickly as possible. As if they decide to terminate, then he wants to move on with the backup buyer. Now, let's say that this guy waives his contingency and deposits the additional earnest money. So he says, I'm in. I'm all in. Right? What happens to the backup buyer? Well, if we go back and look at the backup addendum, when he said that he's willing to wait 3 days, It basically says if the first contract doesn't terminate inside 3 days, then my backup contract will automatically terminate and I'll get my earnest money back. So he doesn't have to just sit around and wait forever. Now he could have put 15 days in there. But he knows this guy only has 2 days to make a decision, so he wants to probably time it to be as close as possible to that amount of time. Does that make sense? It wouldn't have made sense for him to put 1 day in there. Because this guy gets 2 days. He needs something a little longer than the 2 days. He could have put 2 days, but it probably would have, probably better to make it a little bit longer. Yes, ma'am.
What is the date that you use on the backup contract?
The date it's signed. Okay? So let's say that it was signed on today, 2/27. So we agree, we're to terms, we signed the backup addendum, so it's dated 2/26, today, right?
Okay,
But he's got to wait 2 days to figure out if this guy's in or out, right? What happens? Well, he's just in a parking position. He's not the contract. He's just the backup contract. So if this guy terminates, if he basically sends back this notice with number 2 check saying, I'm out of here, right? Then this seller sends this backup buyer the next notice that you've got. It says seller's notice to buyer of removal of contingency under addendum for backup contract. See that one? And it says the first contract's gone. We're now the contract. And oh, by the way, the date of this notice to you amends the effective date of our contract. So now your option period starts. Now the amount of time for me to deliver the survey to you begins. So he doesn't get penalized for having to wait 2 or 3 days. Okay? This notice amends his effective date to the date of this notice. But that only happens if this first contract terminated. If this contract didn't terminate, then the backup contract expires and he gets his earnest money back. Okay? Now, it's usually at this point that a lot of people kind of go, this was never talked about in real estate school. I don't think I signed up for this part. I thought I would just get to look at pretty houses. And I don't mean to scare you with forms, but you're going to end up with buyers that have to sell in order to buy. And you're going to be filling out this addendum for sale of other property by buyer form with filling in blanks A, B, and C. Right? You're going to need to know the appropriate things to try to negotiate in those blanks. And you're going to have to explain to your buyer, this could happen. It doesn't happen often, but it could happen. Now, I will say that in this past year, 2014, I saw more backup contracts, knockout addendums for sale of other property than I have in the previous 13 years of my real estate life. And why was that?
Lots of buyers, or the sellers. aren't-
Terrible inventory. There wasn't enough inventory. More buyers than sellers. So people were willing to go ahead and write those backups and get rid of these contingencies and move them out of the way. Okay? Now, as the market becomes more even, which it might be on the trend for doing that here in 2015, then we might get back to maybe a little bit more normal life. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, if you saw something in the computer that said PS, you would just pass it up, not even show it. Now you're pulling up actives, OPs, PSs, going, I got to show these people something, right? The 4 houses I'm showing you today are already under contract, but we could write a backup. Make sense? So if you get into a scenario where you're either this agent receiving the addendum, or you're the agent that wants to write the backup contract, or you're this agent with the addendum for sale of other property, and you've forgotten this scenario, then that's when you get in touch with me, or Veronica, or one of the other experienced agents here in the office, and they'll kind of walk you back through it, okay? Good. Now, just briefly, before we move on, I just want you to now kind of switch roles. We've been talking about ourselves being the agent representing this party, right? I want you to now think of yourself as the listing agent on this Glenlock Farms property and how you can help protect your seller when you do get an offer in that's got this addendum for sale of other property attached to it. Okay? Because you're all going to be listing agents and you're going to get those kind of offers.
Now, your seller could just reject that, right?
Sure you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can, I mean, in this kind of market, I mean, if you're gonna have, you're pretty sure you're gonna have backups, you don't take a contingency.
Right.
Okay.
Right. But is this market going to stay just like
No,
this?
we just hold it.
Yeah. So if you're the Glenlock Farms listing agent and you receive an offer from another agent with this addendum for sale of other property attached to it, what's something you want to know? I want to know, do they have their house under contract? Oh yeah, we got a contract in on Sunday. We just executed the amendment yesterday. We're out of option. Perfect. I'd like to see a copy of your contract. Is that a legitimate request for this listing agent to ask of this agent?
Yes.
Sure it is. Now you'll sometimes get some pushback from this agent going, well, you can't see that contract. It's got a sales price on it. Go, well, black it out and email it over to me. I want to see the contract that your seller, your buyers have executed so that I can present it to my seller. And I want the contact information for the agent representing the Austin buyers and the loan officer representing the Austin buyers. I'm making a phone call. I'm making a phone call to the loan officer representing these people and the loan officer representing those people. Don't just take a pre-approval letter attached to the contract as some type of piece of gold and it's perfect. Even if it's from one of these guys sitting around our office here. You get up, go talk to them, or call the loan officer and go, you don't know me, but your clients have written an offer on a listing whose clients are writing an offer on my listing. And it's a contingency. So I need to be able to present a clear picture to my seller of where we are in the process. What can you tell me? Sometimes you'll get a loan officer who will be just very helpful and try to give you as much as they can without divulging any private or confidential information. To me, they get a gold star that they answered their phone or called me back. That's a big plus, because there are some who won't do it. And that makes me nervous. Right? Would it make you nervous? So, protect your seller by doing your homework. Because what if you got a copy of this contract and Austin's contract to Terra Nova West had a contingency on their house in Austin for people that are moving from Corpus? Would that be good information to know? Would you have known that if you had just said, oh good, great, I'll present my offer? You wouldn't know without asking questions and getting copies of stuff. Because if Corpus doesn't perform, Austin's not performing, and Terra Nova West isn't performing, and guess what you're doing with your Glenlock Farm people? They're building a $2.5 million house in Magnolia that you're on. That's a $3 million transaction for you, right? $400,000 here, 2.5 out of Magnolia. Would it be kind of good to know that their house in Glenlock Farms is going to close? So don't be afraid to trace that money back and ask for copies of those contracts and call the agents and the loan officers involved so that you can sit in front of your sellers and go, I know it's not what we wanted, but here's what we have and here's what I've done. Because the worst thing that could happen is you not doing that, and a week before you're supposed to close on this house, Terra Nova West calls you up and go, I have some bad news. The people in Corpus aren't going to be able to close in Austin. You're going, who are you talking about? Corpus? I don't know what you're talking about. Oh yeah, there were people in Corpus that were buying in Austin, and the people in Austin that were buying here in spring, and you didn't do your homework. And now you got to go back to your Glenlock Farms people and with your tail between your legs and go, oops, we got a problem. Okay? Helpful?
So what are some things you can do if you do get a lot of pushback, like from another agent or the lender, where you're not getting very much information. Or
Well,
that not normally.
I mean, I would, if I was calling the loan officer for the Austin deal and I'm not getting a response, I'm calling back this agent who wants me to accept their offer and go, just want to let you know, I've been trying to research and introduce myself to people down the pipeline here and I'm not getting a response. So any way you can put some pressure on these people to call me back? Because I'm not even presenting your offer to my sellers until I have a clear picture of what's going on. Believe me, they'll start jumping. Okay? All right, so we're going into the third section of the class, which is amending and terminating the contract. So turn to the amendment. So once a contract has been executed by all parties, and we've got an executed date in there, and it's all wrapped up nice and neat with a bow, life happens to that transaction, and things, unfortunately, have to be modified or changed. And we've got to document those changes because we want to try to keep the deal together. So rather than pulling the contract back out and making changes to it and passing it back around between the parties, we document the changes by executing amendments. There could be multiple amendments to a single contract. And right now, we've got 9 different opportunities to modify a contract with, and once we even change one thing, we can change it again later. So you could end up with several amendments to a contract. So if you do have amendments to a contract, don't think you've done something wrong. It's just the way life happens during the life of a contract. So let's talk about kind of the first steps for some of those changes. What's the first activity that our buyers are engaged in as soon as we get under contract? What's the first phase of that transaction? The option period. And during the option period, we're going to do the inspections. Okay, so we want to instruct our buyers that at a minimum, if we go back to that notice to prospective purchasers form that we had them sign, that we want to see them do at least 2 inspections on the property. The first would be the normal structural mechanical inspection by a licensed inspector, right? What's the second one we want to have them do? Wood destroying insect, termite. It's really called the WDI, wood destroying insect, but primarily we're looking for termites. So those are the 2 at a minimum we want our buyers to conduct. But just because they just do those 2, that might not be enough. Maybe it's on a piece of property that's got a septic system, and the structural mechanical guy doesn't do septic inspections. Well, that septic inspection maybe needs to get inspected. Maybe it's on a property that has a pool, and again, the structural mechanical guy doesn't do pool inspections. Well, then we need to get a pool guy out there to take a look at that pool. So you want to make sure that all of the major components of the house have had an inspection done to them. And you want to help your buyer identify what inspections he should be conducting. Now, we want to give, if they ask, a multitude of choices for the buyer to pick from. At least 3 choices for each one of the inspection processes. So if you're asked and you want to provide that, you want to make sure you give them multiple choices. Now here's the problem. They want you to pick one for them. They'll ask you, well, which one would you pick? Which is the best? Who would you hire? Right? And you need to avoid those trap questions and say, any one of these 3. I wouldn't have given you these 3 if I didn't believe any of these 3 could have done the job. So pick one of these 3. I understand that, but which of those 3 would you pick if you had to pick one today? Any of the 3. I'd probably pull them out of a hat, but any of these 3. You need to pick one. So don't let them trap you into suggesting one specific inspector. That is a liability for you, right? Because if something goes wrong, who do they blame? Do they blame the inspector? Maybe, but you're the one that told them about the inspector, so they really blame you. So make sure you don't fall into that trap. And secondly, they should set up the inspections. You're not the concierge to call up and schedule the inspection and make sure it happens. They do that. Now, you need to know what they do so you can pass that on to the listing agent and schedule that time with the seller, but don't feel like you're the concierge that has to make all the decisions and all the inspection appointments and all that. They have an active participant role in setting up their inspections. And then finally on inspections, it's my advice not to attend the inspections. The buyer can attend the inspection if he wants. I usually would encourage them to come towards the end, but you should not be in attendance for the inspection. And if they insist that you come, then you can say, all right, I will be at the property, but I will be in my car, on my phone, on my computer, doing my work.
Why is that?
Because you could hear something that doesn't get down into the report, and after closing, there's a problem with that, and everyone's sitting on the witness stand, and the appraiser says, well, I told your agent. And you're like, what? I don't think you told me. So it's best just not to even have it as a possibility. If the inspector's got something to say, he needs to put it in the report or call the client and tell them, not you. You're not the conduit of that information. Yes, ma'am.
So we're not gonna be there for the inspections. Who lets the inspector? access the
90% of
home?
most inspectors have a super key. And if they don't,
They call the listing agent?
no, if they don't, I don't have a problem going over and letting them into the property. They all know how to make it lock back up and turn on alarm systems and all that. They're an agent of the buyer just as we're an agent of the buyer. So they have the approval per the contract to enter the property and inspect the property. We don't have to be there with them.
Can we give them the code if it's a combo?
No. Not unless you would get the listing agent's approval to do it. Combo locks.
There's a lot of those still.
Ooh. You need to raise your average sales price.
I'm trying.
And you will
That's
get
my
away
first
from
one.
combo locks.
I couldn't turn it down. It's my first one.
Okay, so they need to have the inspections done. They can attend the inspections if they want. And now they've got the inspection reports back and they're looking at you and going, now what? Well, do you have any questions about the inspection reports? Have you researched any of the issues that the inspector brought up on the inspection report? If you've got questions, you don't understand what the inspector was saying, who should they be asking? The inspector. They just spent $400 on an inspection. They should be able to pick up the phone call and call him back up going, I don't know what you mean here. And he should be able to explain that to them. It's not just do the report and I'm done. He is hired by them to help them determine the condition of that property. So, now that they've got that information back, they've got a couple of choices. During the option period, they can do one of four things. They can either come to an agreement on repairs, they can extend the time to perform under the option period, so we can extend the option period so that we can talk about it more. They can terminate because they either can't come to an agreement or they get an inspection report back that says that the crack is in the slab is no way can be fixed, and they go, well, I don't want that problem. Can they terminate during their option period? Absolutely. Well, fourth thing they can do is just accept the house. Just let the option period expire. Then they just bought the house as is without any repairs to negotiate. So those are the four things that can take place during an option period. So how do we come to an agreement on repairs? Well, there's multiple ways. So in our first blank there, or in actually paragraph number 2, you could specifically list what you want the seller to complete on the buyer's behalf prior to closing. So looking at the inspection report, listening to your buyers about what they want to see done, then we go through and we list it out in paragraph 2. We have the buyer sign the amendment. We attach the supporting documents to our amendment, the inspection report, and we call up the listing agent and tell them that we are sending over the amendment with the requested repairs. And we email it or fax it over so that they can then receive it and present it to the seller for the seller to determine what they want to do. The seller has the opportunity to completely start negotiations all over. Okay, well, I'll do these, but I'm raising the sales price by $5,000. Or, heck no, I'm not doing any of this. I told you when I sold you the house, it was as is. I mean, it's all over the place during that opportunity. So now the buyer has got to make a decision about what he wants to do. Does he want to modify his list? Do we want to agree to what the seller said? The seller came back and said, well, I'll do these 3, but not all 5. So you just negotiate back and forth between the buyer and the seller as to what they come to an agreement on. And whatever they agree to has to be documented in an amendment and signed by both parties prior to the option period expiring. Now, the repairs don't have to be done during the option period. They just have to be agreed to during the option period. Okay? The other way to negotiate repairs is by money. I like this option. So if there's possible, depending on the level of repairs that need to be done, it could work out to where the seller can pay the buyer money at closing so that the buyer can do the repairs after closing. And the best way for that to happen is for the seller to pay some or all of the buyer's closing cost. Most buyers have approximately 3% of their purchase price in the form of closing cost. So on a $200,000 house, we're talking about a $6,000 allowance that we've got to work with on repairs. And maybe the repairs are only $2,000 when we kind of get some bids and kind of get an idea of what it's going to cost to replace the hot water heater and fix the rotted wood around the back of the garage, whatever the issues are. And the buyer goes, well, I'd be willing just to take $2,000. Well, the best way to document that in an amendment would be to check box number 4 on the amendment and put $2,000 in the blank there. And effectively what we said is that the seller is going to pay $2,000 of the buyer's closing cost at closing, and now the buyer didn't have to pay that money. So he just made $2,000, right? He was expecting to have to come to closing with $6,000. Now he wants to come to closing with $4,000. So that extra $2,000 is sitting in his checking account, and he can use that to make those repairs. That's the ideal way for repairs to be negotiated. I like it that way because I like buyers doing the repairs after closing. Because if the seller's doing the repairs, are they hiring the most experienced, most expensive person they can find to conduct all the repairs? They have to find qualified people, and people, if it's a licensed issue, it has to be a licensed person, but they're probably not looking for someone to do above and beyond, right? Now, if the buyer gets $2,000 at closing, and he goes, well, I really think I'm going to go from a 40-gallon tank to a 50-gallon tank just to make sure I have extra hot water. So it's going to cost me $3,000 to do that. Well, you can make that adjustment after closing, right? I like that scenario. Now, let's say that we cannot come to a decision during the option period. Maybe more information needs to take place. We've got an inspector that said, wow, this is really, I'm thinking maybe something's going on with the slab. Can't be sure. There's enough deviation to give me an indication that maybe it's not performing as it should. You should get a structural engineer out here to determine. We call a structural engineer. He can't be out till Wednesday of next week. And our option period ends on Tuesday. What do? Well, we can extend it. So we pull out a blank amendment and we go down to number 6. And we would pay an additional option fee for the ability to extend it for a couple more days. So how much additional option fee do we pay? It's negotiable, but I kind of like using the daily rate that we established when we wrote the offer. So if I paid a $150 option fee for a 10-day option period, how much is my daily rate? Come on, guys, do math. 150 divided by 10 is
15.
$15. See, if it's not 3% of something, realtors just can't do the math. I think that's the problem. So, $15. So if I need a 2-day extension, pay $30 to get a 2-day extension of the option period. I think it's fair, right? All right? So does everybody understand the process during the option period and what we need to get accomplished with the inspections and the repairs and all that? One final note, there will be times when you call up the listing agent and you say, all right, I'm sending over the amendment along with the requested repairs, and they'll say, don't send the inspection reports. Why do they say that?
They don't want to know about anything.
They don't want to know, and if they know, does their seller automatically know? Yes. Even if they never show it to their seller, just because the listing agent got it, the seller just found out about it. So sometimes you'll get a listing agent who goes, don't send me the inspection reports. Now I personally believe that is a poor service to the seller. It's their strategy, and they believe in it, but I think it's not the best strategy. I think sellers need to know the reality and need to deal with it and face it. Because if they're not going to get this deal done based on what that inspector said, guess what the next inspector's going to find? Same darn stuff.
So if the seller gets the inspection report back and he now is enlightened that there's a crack in the
He
foundation,
has knowledge.
he then has to tell the next potential buyer
Correct.
that there's a crack in the foundation.
That's exactly right. So that's why you get agents going, don't send me the report.
So would that mean that they would be having to update the seller's disclosure?
All right, let's cover a few of the others that we didn't mention. So number one is pretty easy, pretty self-explanatory. If we need to change the sales price, why would we need to change the sales price? House didn't appraise, right? House didn't appraise, and the parties now agree to selling it what it did appraise at. Maybe the buyer comes after the inspections and says, this house needs a whole new roof. And the seller goes, all right, well, I'll put a new roof on it, but I'm raising the price by $5,000. That's a deal. I'll take that. So he raised the price by $5,000, and the seller puts a new roof on the house. So there's reasons. You can have multiple things checked on the same amendment. Okay? Paragraph 9. The date in paragraph 9, number 3 on our choice. The date in paragraph 9 of the contract is changed to. You guys have the contract memorized, right? So paragraph 9 is the. Take a stab at it. Pick something. What do you think paragraph 9 of the contract is? What's a date that might need to change in the contract? Closing date. So at the time we wrote the offer, April 15th was looking really good. And here we kind of get underway and things are moving along and we get past April 2nd and all of a sudden April 15th isn't going to work. Something's happened. So we now say, well, we really need April 18th to be the closing date. Well, we need to sign an amendment that all parties agree that now April 18th is the closing date. Okay? Here's another one that can kind of happen. We think we're closing this afternoon. The contract says we're closing on February 26th. So we show up at the title company at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and the lender goes, not the lender, but the title company goes, we have the docs, but we don't have the money. And the money's not going to be here till tomorrow. Is it closing today? It's closing, but it's not funding. And that date says closed and funded by that date. So we might need to sign an amendment saying we agree that the closing can take place on now the 27th of the month, right? So even if we think we're closing today, but it's not, if it's going to be another day or two delay, then we need to sign an amendment saying everyone agrees that we're going to wait the next day or two for it to truly close and fund. Okay?
Do you ever, or can you close it without the funding?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
It happens a lot sometimes, like late in the afternoon. Sometimes when we've been rushing, and finally they get documents, but it doesn't close until 5 o'clock, and they can't send the wire transfer until the next morning. So you'll close it that day, but it'll fund the next morning. It's truly not a done deal until it funds. You can still sign all the documents, everyone can sign documents, but buyer's not getting the keys to that house until after it funds tomorrow morning.
Okay, that's not.
Because it's not a transaction until it closes and funds. It takes both together. All right, number 5. The cost of lender-required repairs and treatments as itemized on the attached list will be paid as follows. So lender-required issues for repairs will typically come up after the option period. Most lenders on government loans will not order the appraisal until they know you're out of the option period. They want to make sure you're happy with the condition, and now they're going to order the appraisal. And now that government appraisal is going out, FHA or VA, and they come back and say, well, there's a broken glass and something else. You know, they look at cosmetic issues. Sometimes they pick up on stuff that the buyer was like, oh yeah, I can fix that, I can do that kind of stuff. Well, now we've got a lender required repair. So that's gonna have to be taken care of prior to closing. So who's gonna pay for it? So that's what number 5 covers, are those lender required repairs, typically even after you've negotiated the big repairs during the option period. Okay? Number 6 we already talked about. Number 7, the buyer waives the unrestricted right to terminate the contract for which the option fee was paid. Why in the heck would a buyer waive something that they just paid good money for? Well, here's how it typically works out. Let's say that you've got a buyer who's just Johnny on the spot, taking care of their business as they should. We executed the contract on Tuesday night. They had their inspectors set up for yesterday morning. We've got the reports back yesterday afternoon. We've filled out our amendment. We've sent it over to the seller this morning. It's minimal stuff. And now the seller's looking at the request for repairs going, well, this isn't too bad. But I mean, my God, we're 2 days into the option period here. So how can we nail this thing down? Well, Mr. Seller, let's agree to what they're asking for, but we'll only do that if the buyer will also at the same time waive the rest of their option period. So we go back and throw that to the buyer, and the buyer goes, well, I'm okay with that, as long as you do what I asked for. So number 2's got something listed, and now we check box number 7, and both parties sign the agreement. So his option period just ended. Just because the seller agrees to repairs, and if there's still unused option time, doesn't mean the buyer can't subsequently opt out. It's happened. A house he really likes better went on the market during the option period. So he opts out, moves to that house. Okay, number 8, the date for the buyer to give written notice to the seller that buyer cannot obtain credit approval as set forth in a third-party financing condition addendum for credit approval is changed to. So for you guys who've been through the contract class with me, or you're familiar with the contract, the third-party financing addendum has an amount of time that the buyer has to give notice of his inability to obtain credit financing approval. Let's say that you had negotiated 15 days, and here we are on the 15th day. And we're talking to the lender, and the lender's like, well, you know what? Now that you've given me a copy of what I've been asking for a week, I think I might be able to get that, but I probably won't know for another 2 days. Well, then they can go and negotiate a 2-day extension of that amount of time. Okay, so this gives the buyer the ability to request an extension of that amount of time if the seller wants to give it to them, and that's how it gets documented.
So when we send that, and it's the day of, like the 15th day, and they don't send it back till the 16th day?
You got a problem. Needs to be executed today.
Whoa, okay.
So probably is smart to work on it maybe a day or 2 before it really expires. Okay? Number 9 is exactly what it says. Other modifications. Insert only other factual statements and business details applicable to this sale. So maybe there was something else agreed to that now needs to be modified. Maybe originally they agreed to possession at closing and funding, and now they're going to do possession according to a temporary residential lease. Well, that would be documented here in other modifications. Maybe originally they agreed that the seller was going to buy a new survey, and now the buyer is going to buy the survey. Well, that would be documented here in number 9. Anything else But they've kind of given you on 1 through 8 are the most common, most frequent changes to the contract. But number 9 is the catch-all for anything else. Okay?
I have one.
Yes.
If the listing agent informed me that all utilities were up and running at the property, inspections were done, we had the option period, but we found out that the gas was not turned on, we extended our option period, and the listing agent said that it was strictly her mistake. She is going to be paying my buyers the
Extension fee? Oh.
the re-inspection fee.
Okay.
I noted that on number 9.
Okay.
Per her words, so they could include it on the HUD. That is acceptable?
Perfect. Yeah. Good example. So can you see how you'd end up with multiple amendments on a contract? It'd be nice just to have 1 or 2, but you probably might end up with 3 or 4, maybe 5 amendments to a contract. And something that you might have amended once gets amended a second time. So how do we know which one is the most accurate amendment? Well, it's the one that was dated last. Okay? And you don't restate anything that was previously amended. Let's say that we had an amendment with box number 2 check that talked about repairs. And then a week later, we needed to deal with the closing date. Well, I would have another amendment with only box number 3 checked, and it would be for just the closing date. I don't have to go back and restate what number 2 had last week. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So we've talked about the buyer's ability to terminate during the contract, and that's what's right behind here is the form that they would use to provide that written notice. Because most of the time it says that if the buyer is going to exercise a right to terminate, they must do so in writing. And this form accomplishes that written notice requirement. And it goes through the most common reasons a buyer would have to terminate their contract. The first is during the option period. The second is during the third-party financing addendum time period. The third is during the fact that the property didn't appraise or meet the lender's underwriting requirements, and it goes on. So your most common are going to typically be number 1, number 2. Those are the ones that you would be using to give written notice of the buyer's need to terminate the contract. Now, if the buyer's giving written notice to terminate, what is it that they're trying to protect? What do they want back? Their earnest money. So it makes sense that at the same time that I'm having the buyer sign the notice of termination, I would at the same time have them go ahead and execute the earnest money release form, which is right behind that. Okay? Indicating that the escrow agent should refund the earnest money to my buyer. Now, the thing that I want to make sure that you understand about this form, regardless of whether you're representing the buyer or the seller and they decide that earnest money is going to one party or the other, people need to understand that when they sign this form, it's not just an agreement about who's getting the earnest money. It's an agreement to no longer pursue the other other party for any reason. So if you read A, it says, the undersigned buyer and seller release each other, any broker, title company, and escrow agent from any and all liability under the aforementioned contract. So if someone says, well, I understand that I need to give them their earnest money back during the option period, but I just don't think it's right, and I think I'm going to, sue them after we do this, you need to point that sentence out to them and say, I'm not an attorney. The way I would read this would indicate that you're giving up that right by signing this. So if you truly believe that you've got a cause against the other party, we need to have that conversation now. You need to consult with legal counsel to determine whether or not you really do have an action against the other party. Okay? Title companies will not just give up earnest money because they believe your story over someone else's. They want to see this form signed. They want all parties to be in agreement as to what's happening with the earnest money. Okay? All right, a couple of forms that are behind that are some that you might need to kind of help document the file and bring it into compliance before it closes. You've got a couple of waiver forms there. You've got a waiver of survey and a waiver of inspection. Everyone got the waiver of survey first? Okay. So, this doesn't come up often. And the reason it doesn't come up often is because most lenders want to see a survey. So we're kind of good. Because a lot of our buyers or getting a loan. However, there can be a buyer that's a cash buyer, and in the contract, they agreed to buy a new survey, and all of a sudden we're calling them up, or the title company's calling them up to remind them that it's time for them to order their survey, and they go, you know what, I don't need a survey. I'm good. Well, we, as a brokerage, want to see in our file either a copy of the survey that they're either ordering or that they got from the seller, or this form signed, saying, I waive my right to a survey. And this is our way of saying, you know how important it is to get a survey? You're not holding me liable in the event that after closing you decide it was important and you claim that I didn't tell you it was important. I'm telling you now, it's important. So please reconsider. And if they still want to waive their right to a survey, then please have them sign this form and put it in your file, in the compliance file. You know what I'm saying, right? Behind that, you've got the waiver of inspection. Now, buyers will typically be doing their inspections, but they might decide not to do both inspections. Remember which ones I talked about? Structural, mechanical, and termite. If they choose to do the structural mechanical but not the termite, we need this waiver form signed. They need to waive by checking the box up at the top, I chose not to do the termite inspection. Or vice versa. There are probably 3 instances where the buyer might be reluctant to do inspections on their own. And here they are. The first would be what I call the sophisticated buyer, typically investors. They're buying homes to either flip them or to turn them into rental properties, income-producing properties. They're sophisticated enough that when they look at properties, they know what they're getting. And they've got enough money kind of built into their budget model that they can deal with a problem should they discover that as they're going through the property and renovating it. Okay? So it's not going to be a catastrophe if they find out something doesn't work, where it would be for a first-time home buyer, right? So a sophisticated buyer, if you're working with an investor and they go, yeah, I never do inspections, you need to throw this form in front of them and have them sign the waiver form, okay? The second would be the scenario we talked about a few minutes ago, where the seller has received an inspection report and for whatever reason that transaction didn't close. The property didn't appraise, so that way that buyer left. They didn't come to an agreement on the repairs, and that buyer terminated and walked off. The buyer's loan didn't fund, so that buyer was in default and walked away. But lo and behold, the seller has now an inspection report from that buyer, and they're now having to disclose that to all future buyers that come along. And your buyer is that person, and they go, woo, I just saved $400. I'll use that inspection report. No, we want you to get your own. And if they go, no, in fact, the person who did that inspection report is one of the 3 you recommend. I don't recommend inspectors. I'm giving you a list of potential inspectors. So, and if they say, you know what, I'm going to use this report, then you want them to sign a waiver form. They're not doing an inspection. They're using somebody else's inspection. They can't even call that inspector and ask questions because they're not the inspector's client because they never paid for the privilege to be that inspector's client. Make sense? So anytime they receive someone else's inspection report and decide not to do their own, have them sign the waiver form. The third time a buyer might be reluctant in doing their own inspections is new construction. They believe that because it's new, what could be wrong with it? Right? It comes with a warranty. And that lady, she's so nice. She serves us warm cookies every time we go into the sales office. I don't want to make her mad by telling her we're going to do an inspection. I'm sure Ms. Buyer, new houses need inspections probably worse than resale homes. Anybody bought a new house? There's got some idiosyncrasy with them that you won't figure out until you've lived in it for a month, and then all of a sudden you can't figure out why the garage door keeps going up and down every time you turn the spa on in the master bedroom. So an inspector would have figured that out for you.
My house was built in 1972, but there was a guy, and this is just from neighbors. Goetti was the builder, and they said you could walk around to those houses when they were being built, And if you weren't watching, he wouldn't put the rebar on the foundation.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and all kinds of stuff like
Yeah.
that, you know, that you-
So encourage your buyers to do inspections on new construction. So let's say that we're working on a Lennar home, and our buyers come along and the house is sheetrocked. So it's almost, it's only maybe 6 weeks away from being done. Well, you're not gonna do an inspection then. You're going to do your inspection as the house is complete, which means all the utilities are turned on and all the appliances are installed. That sometimes could be just days prior to closing, because the builder's waiting until the very last minute to get it fully completed, because he doesn't want to see items walk off in the middle of the night. So he's wanting to schedule completion and closing as closely as possible. So as soon as that house reaches 100% completion, that's the time to order the inspection, have the inspector come out, hand over the inspection report to the builder, and say these things. You don't even have to do an amendment. Just hand them the report. Most builders will hit 80 to 90% of the things that the inspector found, and the buyer will be so grateful that they complete those items. The builder's pulling his tradesmen who are still in the neighborhood. The electricians 2 streets over, the plumbers across the street, the painters 3 houses down. He can get those guys in there and get that thing knocked out quickly. And that way the buyer doesn't have to worry about trying to get it done during their 1-year home, warranty, and try to schedule it with work and, the dog and all the other issues that come up after they've moved into the house. So encourage your buyers to do it. Now, ground up inspection is another opportunity. So if they're picking out their lot and they're picking out their floor plan and their elevation, then you can suggest to them that they might want to hire an inspector who will do a phased inspection. And they'll usually do 3 times they'll come out to the property. The first will be just prior to the slab being poured. It's been engineered at that point. They can look at the underground plumbing, they can look at the rebar, they can look at how the slab was engineered, okay, before it gets covered up with concrete. The second inspection is just prior to sheetrock. And at that point, the inspector can primarily look at inside the walls. He's looking at plumbing, he's looking at the framing, he's looking at the electrical, he's looking at the bracing up in the attic, all the stuff that comes up when he can just look at it as a kind of peeling the skin off the house. He can look at it from that standpoint. And then the third is typically the final. It's done, appliances are in, hot water heater's working, all that. And I tell you what, especially for an out-of-town buyer who's come down for the weekend and they picked out a house and it won't be ready for 3 or 4 months, and they're not going to be able to drive by every evening after work or on the weekends, insisting or encouraging them to hire an inspector to do a phased inspection, don't you think they kind of walk into the deal feeling a lot more confident about their house being built the way it was supposed to be built? Mm-hmm. Now the inspector's going to charge them more than he would for a normal inspection, but it's worth money I think well worth spent. Okay? All right, final form you've got is the buyer's walkthrough and acceptance form. So prior to closing, usually the day of or the day before, we want to encourage our buyers to do a walkthrough of the property. Even if the seller is still in the property, encourage them to do a walkthrough. They may not have stepped foot inside that house for 3 weeks. They put a contract on it 4 weeks ago. They may have come for the inspections and they have been inside for 3 or 4 weeks at this point. So I think it's good for them to come through and walk through the property to ensure that it's still in the same condition it was the time that they wrote the offer on it. Maybe some of the repairs that the seller said he was going to do have been completed, so they can inspect to make sure that those repairs were done accordingly and appropriately done. So encourage your buyers to do a walkthrough. Now, we're not forcing them to do a walkthrough, but we want to know they have the opportunity to do a walkthrough. And then at closing, or when they do the walkthrough, have them sign this form. They either chose to do the walkthrough in paragraph B, or they chose not to do the walkthrough in paragraph B. I could care less about paragraph A, because the day before closing or the day of closing is the wrong time to bring up inspections. Oh yeah, you could have done inspections back during that option period thing. Not good. I really care more about paragraph B, making sure they check the appropriate box. Now, if they did inspections, check the box. But I want you to say that if they didn't do inspections and you check paragraph A2, that does not constitute a waiver. We want a waiver form signed, because it's got much stronger language in it saying they're not going to hold us liable. Okay? Any anything else? Anything other questions I can answer for you guys? Is this helpful? Good. All right, I'm done then.
Can you watch it again?
You want to watch it again? I guess. I don't know where they're posting those, so
Thank you.
look for it on Jimmy Fallon. Ooh, I hate to touch it.
Can you shine light?
You bet. Thank you. You've been in my classes
I
before.
have, except for the,
Do you have another one signed sometimes? Or?
no, I just forget.
Forget.
my minutes, so I have to come back.
Okay. Oh, there you go.
Do you want to sit on it, so? Do you want to?
No. I keep hoping they'll fire me and they haven't yet, so.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So if we haven't done any contracts or anything yet, it's still okay for this to be a little bit foggy, right? For me, in the fog, because it, you know, you ask these questions and I'm looking at you with deer headlights.
Yeah.
I'm thinking,
I know.
but it's gonna get better.
It'll get better, yeah.
That's
The
what
thing
I'm
that I
wondering.
can encourage you to do is practice writing contracts.
Okay.
So go randomly
Well,
pull a house off the MLS and just say, I'm gonna write an offer on this house. Just practice writing an offer on it.
And it's different scenarios, like if they want, there's a problem with the pool or there's issue, just make up stuff so you can figure your addendums
Yeah.
and things out. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Good
And
idea.
maybe partner with somebody.
Yes.
You know, that would really kind of, because that way you're kind of thinking outside the box a little bit, kind of stretching it.
Well, we're quiet here because we're all sort of came in at the same time. So
Okay.
I don't think we're stupid. We're just overwhelmed right
Well,
now.
the deer in the headlight look was obvious.
We didn't.
I know, my friend that wants to buy and
There are a
sell.
couple of experienced people in there.
I have
Said my
one
friend that
on
wants to
the,
buy and sell after the
oh gosh, and I just blacked
Getting an
out.
anxiety attack.
We'll be together. You know, right?
Yeah.
Because I have my workbooks from classes too.
Well, plus I went,
So, you know.
yeah, and I went and asked Veronica to like pair me up with somebody like, you know, a mentor to.
The third party financing.
But-
Somebody?
Yeah, she
We
she's
are-
pretty sure she has somebody in mind, so she's gonna check with them.
Tomorrow's the last day.
Yeah, I mean, I don't care if I can pay
When was the
them.
contract? It all depends on when the contract was
It
executed.
was executed the
Well, that's like you, what I figured.
7th of
Next
February.
where you can kind of need help on. I'm just gonna.
How many days did you
Well,
have?
yeah, just somebody that like I can call on.
Okay,
And
so
today
It's true,
I
to
need
have
my
someone
shirt on.
ahead of time.
Saturday will be
Yeah.
your last day.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I wouldn't mind
Well,
going
like having
like
someone
a.
ahead of time, because I'm
28th.
thinking kind of like you.
So
where
it's
we have
7?
something
It
happen,
was
like,
21. I counted
So
7.
the 8th is day number 1, not the 7th.
probably will already want someone to call.
I kinda
But you're not gonna be able to
think
get it over the
that,
winter
yeah,
on
we-
Saturday. So if you need to get it figured out, you got
Oh,
to
yeah.
this afternoon
And
and
I'm
tomorrow
kinda working on a
to
little
determine
bit
how the
of
lender is looking at
But,
their credit.
you know,
We're not talking about
yeah,
loan approval.
I'm helping her on the blocks.
Because I guarantee if you call me, go, we don't have loan approval yet. No, I'm not looking for loan approval. I'm basically stating, does the buyer have the credit worthiness in order to get future loan approval? Do you see anything in their application that would preclude them from getting approved for the loan based on their credit worthiness?
Well, see, I got an email stating that they are very backed up and they're still reviewing other loans as in the order that they will receive.
Who's the lender?
But not for me if I'm doing it for her.
The actual lender is.
So-
Do they have a loan officer or an underwriter, someone that, a processor? Processor would probably be the, who's the contact point?
Impact Capital Mortgage
You know,
One.
so I've already printed 50, but then.
And he's been supposedly,
So
you
he
know,
was gonna
sending
give me
himself, so the
shut it down.
manager from 360 Capital sent that, email yesterday.
So when they pick big mortgage companies like that, that's not really kind of face to face with somebody, you know, they're kind of at their mercy.
We hand out for her day, for her.
So,
So this
they
is-
just need, they're gonna have to kind of roll the dice with it and kind of say, you know, either they are or they aren't.
Open house,
And if they haven't heard any reason why they couldn't be approved,
whatever. And she
then
said,
they can let that time expire.
"That's for Saturday."
But if they,
And my flyer
if they
has
still think there might be an
10%
issue,
at the same time.
then they
But,
should ask for
you know
an
what I'm saying?
extension
There
or they
won't
should
be too
terminate
many
under
towns
the
will just
third party.
randomly.
Okay,
So,
once they're
so
out of
again,
that third party
and show up,
financing,
so I'm like,
if they don't get approved,
I'm not gonna be.
they're
Based
still
on their-
bound to that.
Then they're gonna be in
It's
default,
once a year,
and they're
it's
gonna lose their
once a
honest
year.
money.
So I don't wanna miss that on networking.
There has to be somebody the buyer can talk to.
I think it's a great time.
My
to go
buyers.
out there and do some networking, so.
I would go back to your buyers and say, you
I feel
know,
like I can't help her.
I'm not getting a lot of
You know, when
information
I work
from you.
together, but.
You need to know that after Saturday, if you can't close because of something in your credit, and I'm not saying there is, but just anything, that would keep you from getting approved because your income is too low, or it hasn't been, you haven't had enough time for your money to be in your checking accounts, whatever those issues are that aren't property related, they're credit related, then you're gonna be in default and you're gonna lose your earnest money. So is there any way you can talk with the lender and just feel really good about the fact that from a credit standpoint, everything looks as good as it can?
That's true. The listing agent has put the house up pending until they show.
And it's not
Even
a
if it's
contingency.
no, even if it's third party.
They'll do that just so that they might be able to get a backup, but, you know, they can't come back to you like we did today and say, oh, I've got a backup contract, you've gotta do something. I mean, if they got a backup offer, they basically have to let your buyer perform. Maybe, when's your closing date?
The 16th of March.
So a backup could come in and say, oh, I'll be a backup till the 16th of
So
March.
it took me all day long, just
Okay.
putting it down, 10 minutes before this, just to get a flyer.
Thank you
create,
very much.
generate, and figure out the business card. So I mean,
And that
so I-
one
I-
question,
that's
or
what
that
it
one,
is.
yeah, the scenario that I threw out there for you, it's,
well,
even if the listing, because she and I were confused, the listing agent and myself, when we were talking about, the listing agent paying the fee for the reinspection to my buyers. Because she was under, and I saw it too, when I first read it, I was like, well, it's not an agreement that the seller is wanting to pay my buyers, it's the listing agent, so I thought maybe that didn't go there, and she thought the same as I did. But, you know, we were told by,
No, I just called.
I asked around here and they said that we could include it, and then
But I need it for tonight.
I asked the
I
title
need it for
company.
tonight. I'm not gonna
And
do
they
the
said
one
that, yeah,
to
go ahead and
tomorrow.
include it there, because the lender's gonna have to know that, you know, where's this money coming from, and we have to put it in the HUD. So she's like, go ahead and put it there.
I have a camera.
Y'all
So-
y'all done?
One of those things